The ceasefire had been in effect for 9 hours when the water changed color, not dramatically, not in a way that would register on any sensor suite or populate any threat display. Just a faint, barely perceptible shift in the thermal gradient reading on the forward hull-mounted sonar of USS Cole. A guided missile destroyer operating as the lead element of a transit escort formation, moving northward through the Strait of Hormuz at 6:41 a.m. on March 14, 2026. The shift was 0.3 of a degree. It lasted 1.1 seconds. The sonar system's automated anomaly processor tagged it, assigned it a low-confidence classification of possible thermocline variation, and moved on. The system had produced 11 similar tags in the preceding 4 hours, all of which had resolved as genuine oceanographic variation in the thermally complex shallow water environment of the Strait. The Sonar Supervisor did not move on. He had been in the Navy for 14 years. He had operated hull-mounted sonar systems in the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the South China Sea, and he understood, not from doctrine, but from the accumulated physical intuition of a man who has spent thousands of hours listening to water, that the thermal signature he had just seen was shaped differently from the 11 that had preceded it. The others had been gradual, smooth-edged, the organic curves of water temperature shifting under tidal influence. This one had a hard leading edge, a boundary, the kind of boundary that forms not when water masses mix, but when a solid object displaces water as it sinks. He flagged it at 6:42 a.m. He called it a possible bottom influence contact at 6:43 a.m. His division officer had the report on the bridge at 6:44 a.m. At 6:44 a.m., USS Cole was 3 nautical miles inside the Strait of Hormuz, proceeding north at 12 knots as part of a 5-ship escort formation accompanying 2 liquefied natural gas tankers toward the Persian Gulf. The ceasefire announced 12 hours earlier, brokered through Omani mediation following 14 days of the most intense US-Iranian military exchange since the 1980s, had been cautiously welcomed by energy markets that had watched oil prices climb past $120 per barrel over the preceding 2 weeks. The Strait of Hormuz had been partially restricted to commercial traffic since March 1st. The escort formation was the first U.S. Navy chaperoned commercial transit since the ceasefire announcement. It had been authorized at the highest levels of Fifth Fleet Command as a deliberate signal. The Strait was open, the United States Navy was present, and the international energy supply chain would resume. The IRGC Navy had been planning for exactly this moment since March 9th. The planning had begun, not as an act of aggression in the conventional sense, but as what Iranian naval doctrine designated a strategic denial preparation, the pre-positioning of area denial assets during a period of reduced U.S. surveillance tempo, intended not necessarily to produce immediate kinetic effect, but to create a latent threat architecture that could be activated or leveraged at a diplomatically chosen moment. The logic was precise and professionally constructed. A minefield, once confirmed in an internationally critical shipping lane, becomes a diplomatic instrument as much as a military one. It forces a choice on the adversary. Clear the mines publicly, which requires time and acknowledges Iranian capability to contest the Strait even during a ceasefire, or transit the mines and accept the risk of catastrophic loss. Either outcome served Iranian strategic interests. Either outcome extracted a cost from an adversary that had spent 14 days conducting the most intensive air and naval bombardment campaign against Iranian infrastructure since the Iran-Iraq War. The IRGC's mine warfare specialists had identified the ceasefire announcement as the optimal window for exactly this reason. U.S. naval surveillance assets, which had been operating at sustained high tempo for 14 days, would be in a transitional posture as operators rotated. Systems underwent deferred maintenance, and the operational rhythm shifted from wartime intensity to the more ambiguous cadence of a monitored cessation of hostilities. Surveillance satellite pass schedules, which American planners had not modified in the ceasefire transition period, left a 47-minute gap in persistent overhead coverage of the Strait's southern shipping corridor between 1:03 a.m. and 1:50 a.m. on March 14th. The IRGC mine warfare cell had known about that gap for 3 days. They had built their deployment timeline around it. In that window, beginning with the ceasefire announcement at 9 p.m. on March 13th and executing through the early hours of March 14th. 4. IRGC. Navy fastcraft operating without navigation lights had transited the Strait's southern shipping lane at high speed, each carrying 8 bottom-influence mines of the modified EM-52 pattern, rocket-propelled, magnetically fused, designed to rest on the seafloor and detect the acoustic and magnetic signatures of large displacement vessels passing overhead. The EM-52 variant deployed that night had been modified with a dual-influence fusing system that required simultaneous acoustic and magnetic threshold detection before activation. A modification intended to reduce the probability of accidental detonation by smaller vessels and fishing traffic, which would have produced premature discovery before the intended target entered the field. The planners had thought about this. They had thought about the fishing boats and the dhows, and the small commercial craft that transited the Strait's shallows at all hours. They had thought about their minds' indifference to those vessels, and had modified the fusing accordingly. They had planned, in other words, to be patient. 32 mines, deployed in 2 interlocking patterns across a 12 nautical mile segment of the primary northbound shipping corridor. The first pattern, 18 mines, covered the corridor's central navigation band. The second pattern, 14 mines, covered the eastern margin. The shallower draft routing that vessels sometimes used when the central band was congested. The deployment had taken 4 hours and 17 minutes. The fast craft had returned to their base at Kesham Island at 3:31 a.m., well inside the surveillance gap. By the time the escort formation entered the Strait at 5:58 a.m., the mines had been resting on the seafloor for 2 hours and 27 minutes, invisible to surface radar, invisible to aerial surveillance in the fully developed morning light, invisible to every sensor system aboard every ship in the formation except one. The hull-mounted sonar on USS Cole, which had detected the thermal displacement signature of a mine resting on the seafloor beneath the thermocline at 6:41 a.m., and whose Sonar Supervisor had looked at a 0.3 degree anomaly lasting 1.1 seconds and decided it was worth a flag. At 6:46 a.m., the formation commander ordered all ships to reduce speed to 4 knots and cease forward movement. At 6:48 a.m., USS Cole's sonar team conducted a deliberate low-frequency active pulse, a technique that sacrifices acoustic stealth for bottom mapping resolution, and began building a picture of the seafloor beneath the formation's current position and the water ahead. The picture that assembled itself on the sonar display over the next 11 minutes was not ambiguous. 7 discrete bottom contacts, hard-edged, symmetrically shaped, spaced at intervals inconsistent with any geological feature in the Strait's surveyed bathymetric charts. They were arranged in a pattern, a deliberate, engineered pattern. At 6:59 a.m., the formation commander transmitted an emergency flash message to 5th Fleet Command. Minefield detected. Northbound shipping corridor. Position follows. Formation halted. Requesting EOD and MCM assets. The message reached 5th Fleet at 7:01 a.m. It reached the National Security Council Situation Room via the CENTCOM Watch Officer at 7:04 a.m. It reached the Ceasefire negotiating channel, the encrypted back channel maintained through the Omani Foreign Ministry that had produced the previous night's agreement, at 7:09 a.m., where it detonated with the diplomatic force of something that could not be undetonated. The Iranian response, delivered through the same channel at 7:22 a.m., was a denial. The mines were not Iranian. The IRGC had no knowledge of any mining operation. The ceasefire terms were being respected. The response was precise, practiced, and arrived in the channel 13 minutes after the mine contact report. A response time that suggested its language had been prepared before the contact was reported, which suggested the Iranians had known the mines would be found, and had prepared for this moment as a component of the operation rather than as an improvisation in response to it. At 7:31 a.m., AP-8A Poseidon, operating on a post-ceasefire surveillance tasking, transmitted imagery from a low-altitude pass over Keshim Island's eastern boat basin. The imagery showed 4 IRGC fast craft, their hull configurations matching the EM-52 deployment vessels identified in the pre-ceasefire intelligence picture, moored in their standard berths. The craft were present. They were clean. They had been washed. In the post-ceasefire period, washing your boat is not an act of admission. But washing it in the 4 hours between a clandestine mine deployment and a discovery-triggered international inquiry is a data point that the imagery analysts at Fifth Fleet noted without editorial comment in their assessment, which was transmitted to the NSC at 7:44 a.m. At 7:51 a.m., the commander of USS Cole made a decision that was not in any standard operating procedure, not in any fleet guidance document, and not in the 9 hours of ceasefire compliance briefings his crew had received the previous evening. He ordered the ship's rigid hull inflatable boats deployed with his EOD detachment embarked, and he ordered them to begin a systematic physical inspection of the seafloor contacts identified by the sonar sweep, not to neutralize the mines, for which a proper mine countermeasures vessel with full equipment was required and had been requested, but to document them, to photograph them, to collect the kind of evidence that a diplomatic denial cannot survive. The EOD divers entered the water at 7:58 a.m. The water temperature in the Strait at that hour was 22 degrees Celsius, clear enough at 31 meters to work with underwater lighting, murky enough at the margins to require careful orientation against the sonar-derived grid, coordinates that had been transmitted to their dive supervisor's waterproof tablet. The first diver reached the bottom contact at 8:09 a.m. He hovered 2 meters above it for 14 seconds before he confirmed what the sonar picture had already suggested and what no amount of professional preparation fully prepares you for: a weapon resting on the seafloor in water that you are also occupying, designed to detect and engage large vessels. He was not a large vessel. The mine's dual influence fusing would not respond to his acoustic or magnetic signature. He knew this. The knowing did not entirely resolve the 14 seconds. He positioned his underwater camera at 8:11 a.m. He took 6 photographs from 3 angles: the mine's identification markings, the IRGC Navy's manufacturing codes, stamped into the casing in a location that Iranian engineers had presumably not considered would ever be photographed by a U.S. Navy EOD diver during a ceasefire, were visible in every frame. He completed the documentation at 8:13 a.m. The first photograph was transmitted to Fifth Fleet at 8:17 a.m. It reached the Omani back channel at 8:31 a.m., where it detonated with the diplomatic force of something that could not be undetonated. At 8:44 a.m., the Iranian response in the back channel changed. The denial was withdrawn. In its place was a new formulation. The mines had been deployed by elements acting without central authorization. It was a face-saving construction that satisfied no one and documented everything. The mines were Iranian. The deployment was Iranian. And the ceasefire had been instrumentalized as a deployment window by planners who had calculated that the combination of diplomatic cover and reduced surveillance tempo would allow them to establish a latent area denial capability in the Strait before the resumption of commercial traffic gave the international community a stake in the corridor's security. The calculation had been correct on every variable except one. a Sonar Supervisor with 14 years of experience and the specific, unreplicable judgment that comes from 14 years of listening to water. The mine countermeasures vessel USS Pioneer arrived in the Strait at 11:17 a.m., having been diverted from a patrol tasking in the Gulf of Oman at emergency priority. Its crew had been briefed en route via secure data link on the minefield geometry, the sonar contacts, and the EOD photography. They arrived knowing exactly what they were dealing with and exactly where it was, which is as favorable a starting condition as mine clearance ever provides. And mine clearance, even under favorable conditions, is slow, meticulous, and irreducibly dangerous work in which the margin between a completed task and a catastrophic one is measured in centimeters and seconds. Pioneer's remotely operated mine neutralization vehicles were in the water at 11:44 a.m. The systematic clearance began at 11:51 a.m. The procedure for each contact was consistent. The ROV approached the mine from updrift, confirmed identification against the EOD photographic record, positioned a neutralization charge at the prescribed standoff distance, withdrew to safe range, and executed the neutralization command. Each cycle took between 14 and 22 minutes, depending on the mine's burial depth, silt coverage, and the ROV's navigation confidence in the contact's precise coordinates. The process was watched on Pioneer's operations display by a crew that maintained the particular focused silence of people performing irreversible work in a sequential order, where a mistake at contact 7 has exactly the same consequence as a mistake at contact 1. At 4:33 p.m., Pioneer's MCM team reached the final cluster of contacts in the second deployment pattern's northern margin. The sonar survey had identified 3 contacts in this cluster. 2 were cleared by 5:41 p.m. The third, contact 32, did not resolve cleanly on the ROV's approach. The contact's sonar return was present but degraded, its shape less distinct than the 31 that had preceded it. The ROV operator brought his vehicle to hover at 4 meters above the contact and used the ROV's forward sonar in high-resolution mode. The image that resolved on his display showed a mine with approximately 40% of its casing buried in silt. A natural silting event driven by the tidal current pattern in the northern margin of the deployment area, where the seafloor's composition and the local current geometry created a consistent silt transport pathway. The mine had been partially covered in the hours between its deployment and its clearance. The neutralization required a modified charge positioning approach that took an additional 31 minutes to execute safely. Contact 32 was neutralized at 7:24 p.m. It had been resting at the precise track position that the lead LNG tanker would have occupied at approximately 9:15 a.m. Had the formation not halted at 6:46 a.m., had the Sonar Supervisor not flagged his anomaly at 6:42 a.m., had the 1.1-second thermal signature resolved itself in his mind as the 11th routine oceanographic variation of the morning, rather than the first one that looked different from all the others. The displaced water volume of a fully laden LNG tanker passing over a bottom-influence mine at 12 knots produces an acoustic and magnetic signature that an EM-52 variant is specifically calibrated to detect and engage. The rocket propulsion unit drives the shaped charge warhead upward through the water column at a velocity that covers 31 meters in less than 2 seconds. At 9:15 a.m., the LNG tanker's crew had been eating breakfast. Some of them were watching the Iranian coastline through the bridge windows, thinking about the ceasefire and what it might mean for their schedule, and when they might see their families again. They did not know that a device resting on the seafloor 31 meters beneath them had been waiting since 1:14 a.m. for the specific acoustic signature of their hull. They did not know that the device had not received that signature because a man in a darkened sonar room had looked at a 1.1-second anomaly and decided it was worth a flag. They never would know. That is how it works. The protection is invisible until the moment it is the only thing that would have mattered. And by then, the moment has passed, and the breakfast is finished, and the ship is still floating, and the crew goes home. At 9:07 p.m., with the minefield clearance complete and the Strait's navigable corridor certified clean by Pioneer's final survey sweep, the formation commander ordered the escort formation to resume its northbound transit. The two LNG tankers, which had been holding in a circular pattern south of the minefield for 14 hours and 21 minutes, turned north. USS Cole took her position at the formation's lead. Her sonar was active. Her crew was at modified watch, their rest rotation adjusted to account for the sustained operational tempo of the previous 15 hours. At 9:12 p.m., as the formation entered the cleared corridor and USS Cole's bow cut northward through the dark water, the Sonar Supervisor completed his log entry for the day. The entry was factual, chronological, and written in the precise, affectless language that watch logs require. It documented the thermal anomaly, the flag, the active sonar sweep, the bottom contacts, the EOD deployment, the photographic documentation, and the subsequent MCM clearance. It contained no editorial comment on what the 1.1 second anomaly at 6:41 a.m. had prevented, because watch logs do not contain editorial comment. What it contained, in the spaces between the timestamps, was the record of a man who had been paying attention when it counted, and had trusted what his experience told him about the difference between water moving naturally and water moving because something that should not be there had just displaced it. At 10:19 p.m., 5th Fleet Command transmitted an operational summary to CENTCOM and the NSC. 32 mines located, documented, and neutralized. 0 ships damaged. 0 personnel casualties. Ceasefire status maintained, with formal protest lodged through the Omani Channel. Strait status open for commercial transit. The summary did not name the Sonar Supervisor. Operational summaries do not name petty officers. But somewhere in the chain of consequence that ran from 6:41 a.m. to 10:19 p.m., from a 1.1 second sonar anomaly to 32 neutralized mines, to 2 LNG tankers completing their transit intact, his name was the load-bearing beam. In the Strait of Hormuz, ceasefire is not silence. It is the absence of declared hostilities in water that remains, always, a weapon. The mind that waits on the seafloor does not observe the terms of any agreement. The man who hears it does.